Welcome to the One Within All to the InnerVerse podcast. I'm your host, Chance. Excited as always to bring forward some cutting-edge perspectives to catalyze your consciousness expansion. In the realm of fringe and suppressed subjects, most of which I've spent a decade or more researching, perhaps the most confusing and internally contradictory weirdness comes from the world of UFO sightings and contact or abduction accounts featuring non-human intelligences. But for all the inadmissible woo, devious disinformation, and conflicting cosmologies around the alien question, there are more bizarre consistencies between experiencers than one might realize from a shallow glimpse of these phenomenon. Given that the majority of evidence is anecdotal or derived from parapsychological techniques, and the little green men have yet to land a craft on the White House lawn, it's somewhat understandable that the general public, who are still under the spell of physicalist philosophy, have yet to comprehend the consciousness components implicit in this field of study. And with the enormous volume of experiencer data to sift through, making sense of the big picture requires a serious aptitude for data aggregation that most people just don't have the time or the skill to achieve. Well, my friends, it's precisely for these reasons that I'm stoked to bring back the great Upside writer of many inverted paradigms and the author of the Upside Down book series, Mark Gober. In his last appearance, Mark and I knocked out of the park a discussion about his book on science's hard problem of consciousness and what research shows about a non-local origin to our awareness, along with a second-hour expose on the glaring flaws with virology and germ theory. It was an instant InnerVerse classic, and I'm stoked to do it again today, this time focusing on his 2022 book, An End to Upside Down Contact, UFOs, Aliens, and Spirits, and why their ongoing interaction with human civilization matters. Throughout this excellent Upside Down edition, Mark addresses the common fallacies of belief around humanity's contact with non-human intelligences, folding in the cream of the crop from just about every phenomenon in this domain, which is far more spiritual than it may appear on its surface. To quote UFO researcher Jacques Vallée, he says, "I documented the parallels between contemporary sightings of aliens and the behavior of beings mentioned in ancient times, often interpreted as gods, angels, or devils. They were the daemons of Greek antiquity, the little people of the Celtic fairy faith, the elves and gnomes of Paracelsian tradition, the familiars of the rich witchcraft era. They flew through the air in various devices such as spheres of light. They abducted humans, had sexual intercourse with them, showed them visions of parallel worlds, and gave them messages that changed history. Everything works as if UFOs were the product of a technology that integrates physical and psychic phenomena and primarily affects cultural variables in our society through the manipulation of physiological and psychological parameters in the witnesses." Well, if that ain't a heck of a starting point for discussion, I don't know what is. And in Mark's own summary of his research, he says, this book will examine evidence suggesting that the contact phenomena is real rather than hallucinatory, that it includes elements in the physical world, but also in the realm of consciousness, a spiritual or multidimensional aspect, that it involves a variety of non-human species, whether extraterrestrial, multidimensional, spirits, or otherwise, some of which embody good, some of which embody evil, and some in between, that the phenomenon has been occurring throughout human history, that it has played an important role in our civilization, and that it could be essential to the eventual survival, destruction, or enslavement of our species. Frankly, folks, there's a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. Everyone welcome the master data aggregator and materialist paradigm debater, the great Mark Gober, back to the show. Thanks for joining me, man.
Chance, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate that very well written introduction. Thank you for the kind words.
Oh, it's such a juicy topic. That's like one of the longest intros I've had for a while, but gotta fit it all in. There's a wide lens for this thing. It's not just funny lights in the sky, you know?
It is so complex. I remember, so I wrote this book in 2022, so about 2 years ago. And I remember in the process of writing it, this happens with all the books, I get to a point where I say, okay, I think I can write about this because of something. There's some defense that I have where I can write about something crazy because I feel like there's a good argument. With this book, it was, I don't think anyone knows what's going on here. The best researchers all over the place trying to understand contact with non-human intelligence, no one understands it. So what I try to do is to say, look, I don't know what's real myself, but I'm going to aggregate and survey what people have said about these various phenomenon, people can make up their own minds just so they at least know what's out there.
Yeah, and you did a great job with that, just like with the other books of yours that I've enjoyed. People, if they like audiobooks, can enjoy you reading it yourself, narrating it yourself. That gets the tone just right. Loved that. And I wanted to share at the beginning here my own contact experience, the only one I've ever had that seems like relevant and wasn't iffy. So I was at this event. It was like a camping festival where we were all there to watch a total eclipse. It was going to be totality where we were at. It was the day of the eclipse, not during the eclipse though. I'm sitting around my campsite with two friends, and all of a sudden from behind my car, about 15 feet away from where we're sitting, this beach ball sized white sphere rises up into the air. It's just floating there, glowing white in broad daylight. I run over to the car to try to see, like, is there something projecting this? Is it like a bubble? What's going on? And when I get to the other side of the car, I see 3 or 4 more of them come out of the ground, like phasing through the earth. And then all of these balls, about 20 feet above our heads, start shuffling themselves around and zipping around. They merge into one, they divide again, and then within 30 seconds, they just shoot off at light speed, it seemed like, and they were gone behind a tree line. We didn't see them again. Witnesses, everybody sober, one of the weirdest things I ever saw. So I don't know what that was. I have some ideas, but I share that story just to see how that fits into your framework, or maybe if you've witnessed anything unexplainable in flying yourself.
Well, I have heard stories like that from many people. I have not had my own experience of something like that. When I first started to question consciousness in 2016, I did work with many people who claimed they could contact beings from other dimensions, and they would channel, and they would do things where I could tell it was not them anymore. So sometimes their facial expressions would become very strange. Their tone of voice would be strange, even the language they would use when they would do that. But I haven't actually seen a craft or anything that is paranormal in that sense, or even encountered a being directly that I've seen. So I'm really doing this as a third party, trying to evaluate what others have experienced without having done it myself. Or even in the psychedelic realm, many people talk about encountering an entity. I haven't had anything like that myself. So I'm trying to be as objective as possible. And it's all hard to believe as someone who hasn't experienced it. But when so many people have talked about this, especially throughout history, people have reported strange things. It's hard to deny all of it and say that it's all just bogus.
Yeah, man. And that leads us perfectly into, the direction I had in mind for this show is to just go through the fallacies as you list them at the beginning of the book and work through them throughout the text. The first of which being, and the biggest being, that contact is mere fantasy. So, you kind of just alluded to there's so many reports, and that's a big part of the picture. But why is there more to this subject than just pure fabrication or delusion?
I don't want to deny that some cases could be fabrication or delusion. I think that's a big part of it. The nuance here is that there are, number one, there's disinformation. We know that's a real thing where false things are implanted, false ideas are implanted, or things could be staged, and there can be false memories. People can actually have hallucinations, and so that all those things are possible. But to me, in the totality of it, it seems to suggest that something's going on. The analogy that I use in the book is a bunch of Venn diagrams, so circles that overlap, and you end up in a place where there's a point that all the circles overlap in. It doesn't mean that everything in one circle is true, but when you see a lot of other circles saying the same thing, and there's that overlapping point, to me, that becomes more compelling. And in the realm of contact, that's what we're talking about, by the way. This is not their intelligent beings. And the way that I tried to divide that up in the book is to say there is non-UFO related contact and UFO related contact, meaning non-UFO is just some entity, typically in the realm of consciousness, whether it's in psychedelics or in a near-death experience, whereas a UFO-related contact is more related to something around a craft, something physical. And I'm hesitating here because sometimes it's not even physical, because a person's body seems to be taken aboard a craft, but their body is actually still in one place. So it's their consciousness that's taken, and yet something happens to their body. So this becomes very complicated if we don't really know what anything physical is. Largely, though, I would say there are just too many areas for me to shoot them all down. And I can just list a few. So near-death experiences, channeling, people who remote view, meaning sending their mind somewhere far away in space and time, and they encounter something. A shared death experience where the person's not even dying, but is co-living in the dying process with someone who is dying, and then encounters an entity. And then there's a whole bunch of UFO related phenomena, whether it's an alleged abduction or actually people encountering a craft like you did, or even encountering a consciousness shift associated with the craft. There's all sorts of phenomena there where people actually, it's not just a physical thing. Their consciousness, their non-physical aspects are affected by seeing the physical thing. All of these together, and that's why I had to write a book about it, because there's so many of them. I find it too hard to shoot all of them down. And therefore I conclude the notion of contact with non-human intelligence or other intelligences is not exclusively fantasy. Some of them are real.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And still just like a fraction of the variety of stuff that's going on, but we'll do our best to go through it. And it's my emphasis for this conversation to be more on, we'll talk about the UFOs a little bit, but more on that contact side, because I think there's just a lot more meat on those bones. People see a thing far away. It could be, it's a very brief thing, short-lived. Even what I saw felt like a spirit orb or something. But with so much information out there, man, you do a great job, masterful aggregation of the data. And in one part of the book, you bring up a study that tries to sort out the various types of beings people encounter and the approximate percentages of each relative to each other. So I'll go through the list real quick. We can discuss a few of them. The top of the list is the human-looking beings, 48%. Then short grays, gray aliens, 45%. Taller grays, 33%. Other types, 30%, hybrid beings, 20%, insectoid or mantid beings, 13%, tied with reptilians for 13%, then spirits or ghost forms, 10%, and animal types making up 5% or less. So my first question here, which I think is fascinating to consider, what do you make of the fact that the majority of the cases in this particular data set, and probably the stories out there in general, describe human-looking beings as these so-called aliens?
Well, to me, the first question I ask is, what's our real history? And is the traditional evolutionary story true? Or has there been, I don't even know, there's so many possibilities of what human beings could be. So to me, this implies that we might have cousins, basically, that are way more advanced than we are. Some even talk about time travel. I mean, that sort of thing is difficult to validate, but that comes up a lot, that there could be human or humanoid beings from the future that are coming to the present time, and they're encountering us in our consciousness or in the physical form. I don't know what to make of that, because if we think about our daily lives, we encounter human-looking beings all the time. And then after I did this exploration, I'm wondering, well, how do we really know where these people are from? If you're just walking down the street and not talking to somebody, there's a Pulitzer Prize winner. So a very mainstream guy, but late in his career, he started to study alleged alien abductions. And so did David Jacobs, an associate professor at Temple University. They came to very similar conclusions when studying people who claim to have had abduction accounts, which is that there is a hybridization program between whatever alien beings are involved, and there are many species mentioned, but the human being and the alien beings have hybrid babies, as insane as that sounds. And in David Jacobs's book, again, this is a Temple associate professor, he talks about, it's called Walking Among Us, where he talks about these hybrid beings integrating in human society, where they're effectively indistinguishable from humans, but they're not fully human. So that makes me wonder what's reported in this study. And I just want to show your audience the book that this comes from. It's called Beyond UFOs here, by Ray Hernandez, John Climo, Rudy Shield, and they put together this very thick anthology, really, of people who have contact accounts. So what you just quoted is, these are types of non-human intelligent beings encountered on a UAP craft. And there's a bunch of other stuff too, which is that 75% of the people said they saw more than three non-human intelligences on the craft. So there's all sorts of statistics of people that have these encounters. And again, going back to my earlier statement, there's just so many of these, and they're so bizarre, the reports, that it makes me think there's something to it.
Yeah, we're maybe going to broach into this idea of breakaway civilizations. And I wanted to offer that there's actually precedent for this. That first of all, what we're calling non-human intelligences or aliens, I am very hesitant to call anything extraterrestrial, unless by that word we actually mean from lands beyond land that we're aware of or that is accessible to us. Because it seems like the phenomenon is native to here, from my opinion, or native to consciousness itself, which is here, there, and everywhere. And speaking of bizarre stories, the most bizarre one in the book, from my opinion, was involving DNA analysis of hair allegedly left at the scene of a man's contact experience. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about that encounter that this guy Peter Kary describes and the research Bill Chalker did for this book, The Hair of the Alien. But on that subject, the thing I'll mention about it up front is how the DNA analysis had like Gaelic, Basque type of DNA markers in it. And there's in my other research threads with history and mythology, we talk about it all the time when we uncover evidence all the time that in the ancient world, the ruler class of society were the priests, the navigators, the merchants, and the masons and the builders. So there's lots to suggest that the navigator skills of the priest class and even things like the compass and whatnot were known about way earlier, but secretly, than what the historical narrative tells us about Marco Polo discovering the compass. So they were also obscuring that they had access to other lands, that they were mining for resources. There's evidence of this in the ancient Greek authors about how Britain was being mined for tin and being colonized, but secretly, like they wouldn't just let anyone go there. They're keeping the location hidden. So this idea of breakaway navigators, lands and areas of the earth that are not accessible, that are maintained in their secrecy by a ruler class, that's actually got historical precedent, and it could still be going on today. And the last part of this is that the phenotype that were these rulership classes and they're doing this colonization of a potential ancient worldwide system were like the Gaelic, Celtic type peoples in terms of their genetics. So it's fascinating. But yeah, tell us about that case.
And here's the book, by the way, Hair of the Alien by Bill Chalker. Fascinating read, because on the surface, it sounds insane. Actually, when I first heard the title of the book, I laughed out loud. It sounds so absurd, The Hair of the Alien, but really that is Peter Kary's story is quite remarkable and again, this is in context because many other encounters that people claim to have often have a sexual element to it. And this also speaks to the hybridization component. And people have spoken about like incubus and succubus, where the beings come in your sleep and there's some kind of sexual relation that goes on in a sleep realm. So it's hard for me to know exactly what's going on in any individual case. The detail, this was forensic level analysis. So Peter Kary remembers two women that were not fully human looking. I hope I'm getting all the details right. Not fully human looking in his bed, basically. And I'll just pull up some of the stuff because it's so absurd, where he bit one of the women's nipples and something got stuck in his throat. And it wasn't like skin that he was biting. So it was some kind of other consistency. And then he had this feeling that there was something that one of the women was basically showing the other woman how to do it, meaning some kind of a sexual seduction or something. And then the women vanished. But then when he went to the bathroom to urinate, he noticed that there was a hair in his private area. And so he saved the hair, and Bill Chalker and others have conducted analysis on the DNA of the hair. And that gets to what you were speaking about. There were some strange properties of the DNA. Now, I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Medicine, where I challenge, let's just say, areas of germ theory. And it's making me now question the isolation of all things. I don't feel like I know enough about what even DNA is. So now I'm wondering what's what there. But in any case, there were some strange properties that suggest that maybe he did have an encounter that's physical in some way, and that the beings were not fully human, or that they might have been human in some way, but they were some kind of a strange breed.
Yeah, like a potential offshoot that like maybe developed separately from the rest of the gene pool. If genetics is a admissible science, maybe that'll be a future upside down book. I haven't looked into it enough to question, but what isn't worth questioning, right?
Yeah.
It's all worth
it. I just give that caveat because I don't know. And I know a lot of people are questioning it, and I have seen issues elsewhere in the world of very small things, but in any event, something anomalous, many anomalous things occurred here. And this was not just, someone making a claim, and this was a deep investigation.
Yeah. And on the sexual element of things, there's a really just kind of disturbing element of seemingly physical proof in this broad topic, and that's the cases of unaccounted pregnancies. Can you describe some of the general trends with that and your thoughts on their potential truthfulness?
Yeah. So the terminology that's often used is phantom pregnancies. So these are instances in which a woman becomes pregnant for a few months with a fetus and cannot correlate that with a sexual encounter. And this has even been reported among women who are lesbians. So I give some quotes of women who have reported this. And what happens often is that the fetus just disappears. So I want to find John Mack's quote for you, because this is a Harvard psychiatrist who writes about it.
There's a lot of these cases too.
Yeah. So what he says is that in few cases, abduction researchers have correlated such accounts with recovered abduction memories that occurred at the time that the fetus seems to have been lost or taken. But to my knowledge, no gynecologist has been able to, or willing to verify that the product of conception may have been taken by alien beings or even ended mysteriously. So the point is that this is being reported. A Harvard psychiatrist is saying, look, this is happening a bunch of times. Sometimes it's even correlated with an abduction, and the baby or the fetus just disappears.
Yeah, that just kind of freaky to imagine, but I've heard so many of those accounts, and it almost smacks of like immaculate conception type mythology.
Well, it raises all sorts of questions biologically. What is reproduction? How heredity? It gets into the genetics question too in some ways. How does all this stuff work? And it gets even to a broader question of memory, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But often what happens in these contact accounts is that there's missing time or unaccounted for periods. The implication being that all of us, me and you, Chance, and anyone listening to this, maybe we've had experiences that we don't have access to in terms of our memory. So it's possible that many of us have had quote unquote abduction accounts or had accounts with entities and just don't have an ability to recall what happened. So the phantom pregnancy could be just one example of that, where something happened and they have a physical manifestation that gives them some evidence, or like in Peter Corey's case written about by Bill Chalker, there was some physical evidence that can help to correlate what happened, but the full memory is not always there.
Yeah, man. And in terms of the missing time phenomenon, that's something I've got a degree of experience with, having, wearing a shirt like this. Obviously, I've dabbled with psychedelics in my life, right? And I've had some time dilation experiences where they were even shared a few times with others, that the environment we were in would sort of freeze in a like 1 second loop. And I knew that it was frozen because there was something about to happen that was like on cue, like at a certain time. And in those experiences, me and the other person kind of like paused time somehow and just stayed in that moment and for a long time, what felt like 30, 40 minutes, but what on the clock was only 1 or 2 minutes. And it would last until the point where we like intentionally turned it off. So it's not the same as missing time per se, but like time's dilation, expansion or shrinking is a totally subjective experience, especially once you understand that the universe is mental primarily rather than physical.
And also just the notion of time itself is really an interpretation. We interpret sequence, and that's effectively mental gymnastics, because all we know is the present moment. Everything we consider to be the past is something that is experienced in consciousness in the present, and the same thing goes for the future. So I'll give an analogy, and I can't remember if I discussed this last time, but Dr. David Hawkins, a spiritual teacher, described time almost like if you shoot light through a prism, you end up with a hologram, and you can look at that hologram from different angles. And each of those angles you could regard as different points in time, quote unquote, but really it's just one light beam that's going through this, that's turning into a hologram that you're looking at from different perspectives. So there might just be one ever present now that we have interpreted a certain way, and we're seeing it from different angles, and we call that past, present, future. So from that lens, everything becomes super strange, and it would be totally conceivable that you could compress or expand time. You're also reminding me of something that happens in near-death experiences very often, the life review, where people relive their entire life in a very short amount of time. And then they come back in their body and say what happened. But how is that possible for them to relive everything in a short amount of time? That suggests that there's something going on with this phenomenon that we, using our human brains, seem to distort.
Yeah, it's like maybe there's a reality that's more real than what we consider real, that is rooted in the constant happening of the eternal change, the Tao. And then our disassociation from it could even be related to the way that we look for the sequential, linear, on the clock time to cue us, as opposed to going from internal, shifting ourselves as the real metric of that change. Something I've thought about a lot.
Yeah, well, that really gets to the whole notion of human evolution or personal spiritual evolution, whereby if we're too taken by what we think has happened to us in the past, that can cloud our present moment. Whereas if we just let go of everything that's happened, then we can fully be present and be the best version of ourselves. So it's a simple thing to say in words, but it's a very difficult thing to do for whatever reason. Our human biology seems to entrap us in many ways, where we're bound to the past and we're always thinking about the future. And these concepts are just abstractions.
Yeah, man, that's something I would love to talk about more, but I think we ought to get into the second fallacy here, that staying on subject, that you address the contact phenomenon is not entirely physical, although that's one of the fallacies, is that it is like a nuts and bolts thing. So the next questions will focus around that, but how would you, up front describe the dichotomy between the physical and non-physical encounters? Is there a clear line? Is it blurry?
It's a blurry line, I think, first of all, because, well, we need to take a few steps back and go to our last conversation in terms of metaphysics. What's the nature of reality itself? So if we regard all of reality to be a manifestation of consciousness, where consciousness is the fundamental substrate, and everything that we call physical is actually just an interpretation. It's really just modulations of consciousness, as Rupert Spira puts it. That means that there's actually nothing physical. So the notion of physical versus non-physical is an arbitrary distinction from that lens. And I know there are many people who are also looking at atoms and subatomic particles and asking questions about that, whether the electron clouds are just inferences, and really what we're referring to are energies or frequencies that we're interpreting as something physical, because we have a physicalist mindset that likes to reduce everything to matter. And that's where a lot of the mainstream UFO discussion comes from, is, well, we have a physical paradigm where everything is just made of these atoms, and when you put the atoms together, you get bigger things, like based on consciousness, and material is just an interpretation. Then that changes everything, because then we could have crafts or alleged crafts that appear to be physical, but then you could have experiences within consciousness, like a near-death experience or a psychedelic account, where a person says, wait, I encountered a being. I swear I did, but their body didn't go anywhere. So it was in their state of consciousness that seemed to, quote unquote, travel somewhere. And this is what gets lost in so much of the mainstream discourse. And we see the UFO hearings on TV and things like that. And in many ways, I think it's great that people are asking questions, but the consciousness piece is often left out. And that's one of the things that pulled me into this topic in general, because I started off exploring these paradigms of physicalism versus a consciousness-centric metaphysics, and then started to look at the UFO phenomenon, or just contact phenomena in general. And I said, wow, people are really focused in the mainstream just on physical types of contact, and that misses the bigger picture.
Beautifully said. Yeah, there's basically the whole world has to be reimagined once you get out of the materialist baseline view. And again, this is anecdotal, but I've had an experience one time. It was, again, a psychedelically induced experience, sure, where I bilocated, didn't know I was doing it, but I was laying down in one place and thought that I got up and walked somewhere else and interacted with people, had conversations, and then came back to where I was before and realized I never left there. So like the group of people that I was with in the first place, they perceived me as there the entire time, but the people I interacted with when I went walkabout, they perceived me and had these conversations with me, and I've never been able to make sense of that one.
That is a phenomenon that has been reported, and it would make more sense in a consciousness-centric metaphysics that could happen. Within a physical paradigm, that just doesn't make any sense at all. So I'll give an example that I mentioned in my book. A remote viewer named John Vivanco, I actually interviewed him on my podcast, Where is My Mind? And he told me this story that he was remote viewing, so with his mind, the firebombing of Dresden. So in his mind, he was in the scene, and his body experienced a burn, which went away, but he had physical symptoms basically when he was in one place. So it sounds like he was bilocating, basically. His consciousness was there in one place.
And across time.
And across time, right. Yeah, that's a very important point here, that space and time, those notions also are somewhat arbitrary distinctions, because at all points, it feels it is here and now. It's always here and now. We create perceptions of space and time within our mind, but it's perhaps arbitrary. So for a remote viewer to be able to do this, it would make some sense. And you're also reminding me of what are called telesomatic events, where you have, say, identical twins, where one is burned and then the other twin has a physical burn. So there's some linkage between these two apparently physical beings where something happens to one and then the physical body of the other is affected. So what's going on? There's an interconnectedness here that seems to occur that just blows apart the mainstream paradigm.
Yeah. And then that brings in the question of like, do genetics play a role in that? Because the stories of telesomatic events, they extend beyond just experiencing a similar physical trauma or stimulation as your twin that's actually having it happen. There's the stories of twins separated at birth, and then they meet each other at the age of 40 or something, and they both have wives named Jill, and they both are plumbers, or like there's all these weird ways that their lives line up. Tons of stories like that. But to go forward into the non-physical aspect of this, I love that you revisit the near-death experiences in this book that was so integral to End of Upside Down thinking, and how that folds into contact and abduction phenomenon with the seemingly spiritual encounters people have when their body is temporarily dead or disabled. And one of the cases you included stood out from the others, in which a man who had an NDE during emergency surgery following a motorcycle accident reported that the next thing I remember, I was being guided along in a white world. In front of me was a figure in white robes with long dripping sleeves. He had long hair and long bushy beard that had streaks of black and gray. I felt very warm, at peace, and comfortable. I woke up and told my wife that Gandalf was in charge. The figure I envisioned looked like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. So this was a fascinating one for me, because I once did a type of shamanic journey experience with the intent to contact a personal spirit guide, and was pretty surprised that the guide that I saw and spoke with through my inner sight was none other than Gandalf, exactly as he appears in the films, as if it was played by Sir Ian McKellen. At the time, I chalked it up to it either being like a type of collective consciousness egregore or a personal egregore based on my affinity to Tolkien's books. But this type of report and my personal experience does require us to consider the egregore question more seriously, especially in the context of contact with divine beings or aliens or any other sort of non-physical entity. So maybe help the audience understand the egregore concept as you defined it, and how it might relate to the UFO or alien encounter scenarios.
So as I understand the term egregore, it's basically where when a group of people believe that something exists, they can effectively manifest its existence, whereby people start to see that thing that's been talked about. So let's say Gandalf is this creature from character from Lord of the Rings that many people were thinking about, and therefore he is brought into being through the collective consciousness in some way. That would be the egregore theory. Another way to think about this goes back to the topic of memories, and I'm probably skipping ahead here, but there's a phenomenon called screen memories, which to me is fundamental to anyone who's questioning reality. I keep coming back to it 2 years later, and I can't get around it, where it seems that our memory has an ability to be manipulated by beings. So the work of Mike Cleland goes into this. He's studied people who have encountered different types of animals, often owls, sometimes deer, raccoons. He's often mentioned clowns too. I think they're a minority of cases where a person encounters this entity, let's say sees an owl, and then has missing time, doesn't remember what happened. It's like a few hours later, driving home at night, and they say, what just happened to me? They go to a hypnotherapist to say, can I recover the memories during this missing time? And the hypnotherapist will bring the person into a relaxed state, and they'll say, I want you to go up to this owl in your consciousness, tell me what the owl looks like. And they'll say, wait a second, this isn't an owl, it's a gray alien. So the implication here is that whatever beings people encounter have an ability to create a memory of what we saw of them that's not accurate. So let's apply this to the near-death experience now, which I didn't know about this when I first looked at near-death experiences, but now I'm questioning all of it because they sometimes encounter Gandalf or Jesus or Buddha, all sorts of figures, or just a being of light or deceased relatives, all sorts of beings they encounter. Is our memory of them when the person's resuscitated after the near-death experience, is that what they actually encountered, or was it a screen memory? And is the screen memory based off of, related to the egregore topic, is it based off of your own personal experiences where the screen memory is made to appeal to something within your consciousness? I don't know. I mean, we can't really know the answer to that because how could we? The other related phenomenon is shape-shifting, that there are beings that actually can shift their form. So maybe it's not a screen memory in some cases. It's actually a being that wants to show itself to you as Gandalf, but it's not actually Gandalf. So how do we know what's going on in any of these cases? I struggle with it. We run into real problems of just basic epistemology here.
Right. And the differentiation is also interesting between the idea of the egregore and the Buddhist concept of the tulpa, which was kind of like a secret practice for initiates that's gotten out of the bag in more recent time regarding the creation of a physical being entity out of pure like mental psychic intention. There's some really interesting, that might be something to look into if you haven't seen some of those cases, because there are accounts of intentionally created tulpas. There's an entire Reddit dedicated to people doing that. I don't know, but it's a thing, man. It's a thing. It's a mental reality that seems potentially possible.
Let me just say, from a consciousness-centric metaphysics perspective, the idea that reality is malleable is completely compatible with it. Because if all reality is consciousness, that means everything we think is physical is actually not physical. It's malleable. So sure, in theory, you could manifest something through collective consciousness. And we actually see studies like the Global Consciousness Project, which is an offshoot of work that was done at Princeton, where machines are set up all over the world. They're called random number generators. And these machines behave non-randomly when there's a major global event like 9/11 or some others that they've looked at. And they're constantly monitoring what these machines do. Most people don't even know the machines are there. They're just generating ones and zeros all day. And yet when there's a major global event where people's consciousness seems to be shifted in a certain direction, or there's some kind of emotional heightening, the machines behave non-randomly. So that means physical systems are being affected by collective consciousness. That's just one example on a micro scale, because usually the effects are really small. They're just detected by statistics. But you can imagine, in theory, if people knew how to manipulate consciousness through magical practices, for example, if there's a way to heighten the ability, the intention to concentrate it into having a greater effect, all sorts of things become possible.
Yeah, it gets weird. But I don't want to glaze over the screen memories thing you brought up, because that's also very relevant and fascinating part of it. And my all-time favorite, you included in the book, is the story from the late Nobel Prize-winning scientist Kary Mullis, who suspiciously, checked out right before he would have been the first guy to sound the alarm about the improper use of the PCR test that he created during the cooties situation. But his screen memory experience is very bizarre, involves the potential of shape-shifting animal-like entities. Can you tell us about the Mullis story?
Yeah, again, a Nobel Prize winner had a potential contact encounter where he was in the woods and he saw a raccoon who said to him, "Good evening, doctor." And then he said he doesn't remember exactly what happened next, or he thinks he said hello. And he goes, the next thing I remember, it was early in the morning. I was walking along a road uphill from my house. He doesn't know how he got there. 6 hours had passed and his flashlight was missing. He goes, this is his words. I wouldn't try to publish a scientific paper about these things because I can't do any experiments. I can't make glowing raccoons appear. I can't buy them from a scientific supply house to study. I can't cause myself to be lost again for several hours. But I don't deny what happened. It's what science calls anecdotal because it only happened in a way that you can't reproduce, but it happened.
Yes, the electric glowing raccoon. My friend Gabe, Slick Dissident, frequent co-host. He's going to love that we included that. Shout out to Gabe. Okay, so I know there's more meat on all the bones we've started chewing on, but I think it's a good time to get into fallacy number 3, that contact involves exclusively malevolent. You know, you might guess what 4 is, that it's not exclusively benevolent either, but let's start with the with this side of the coin. My favorite case in the vein of benevolent beings in contact experiences was the woman you describe having an NDE caused by an infection, where she recalls that my grandfather, who had been a doctor and died when I was 7, appeared wearing a white coat. He told me where the 3 main infections were located inside of me. He used Latin terms, though I don't speak Latin, and included some other medical details. Then he disappeared. I re-entered my body and repeated to the emergency surgeon and my husband what my grandfather had just told me. A few days after the successful surgery, the surgeon told me that my grandfather's directions had helped him find a 3rd infection that had not been a part of the original diagnosis. It was exactly as my grandfather had described it, in a hidden part of my pelvis. This is an amazing story, and it reminds me of yet another of my own experiences where I inadvertently became a medium in a seance where a participant's deceased grandfather appeared to me in my mind's eye and communicated details specific to his relationship with her that I relayed and she verified. And it was like a very cathartic experience for her too. And the black-pilled conspiracy crowd is often going to assert that the aliens or fallen angels or the demons are able to impersonate deceased loved ones in order to trick the experiencer. But I don't share that worldview. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible. I just don't think it's always the case. And I think the relative negativity or positivity of the NDEs or contact experiences are a reflection of the experiencer's energy and their own personal identifications. But yeah, a lot of stuff right there. What are your thoughts on the things I just mentioned? How can we expand on that?
I mean, it's hard to generalize with this stuff, to say that every encounter is negative or every encounter is effectively a psyop if it seems like it's positive, because I've had this discussion before. I'll give one more example of a positive NDE that makes me think that there is a benevolent force. Anita Morjani, famous case. She was dying of terminal cancer, tumors all over her body, went into a coma, had a near-death experience. She encountered her deceased father, felt unconditional love, shifted her mindset about many things, including her relationship with her father, comes back into her body and realized with this new mind weeks, and the doctors didn't know what was going on. And she's been speaking about this publicly for years, has written about the topic. What I've heard is like they saved her so that she could go out there and say that the NDEs have positive effects and that there's positive afterlife and things like that. But it's really just a side of the story that you read from my book of the woman encountering, learning more about her own health through the NDE and actually having a benefit from it. So at a certain point, it becomes their own personal judgment. What I have found from talking to people who've had near-death experiences is that, number one, it's not describable with language, the positivity they experience. So they end up having to distort the experience when they describe it to us, and then we're left to try to translate it. And that's problematic because they come back with a certainty and a knowing that words can capture. So that's an important part of this whole thing too, with any contact experience, but any mystical experience too, is that we're trying to bring the finite to something that's not really finite in that way. And that makes it very difficult to interpret. So I think it's not unreasonable then to trust what some of these people say sometimes and say that it becomes far-fetched to say that every single case of a positive encounter is a psyop. I struggle with that personally. Without knowing with certainty, there are too many positive things. I'll give another example. Daniel Brinkley, who I interviewed from Life Reviews, So meaning each time he had a near-death experience, he reviewed his entire life. So this is a very rare case, because we do hear about life reviews in like 20 to 25% of the cases. The person dies and says, look, I relived my whole life. I became all the people that I affected. I felt the good things that I did for them, and I felt the negative things because I became them. And then they come back in their body and their life's transformed. In his case, he became, during his NDEs and his life reviews, he became the people that he killed in combat in Vietnam and got to feel what that was like from their perspective. So it was very traumatic for him to have that happen. So when he came back, especially after the first near-death experience, he said, look, I'm not going to be materialistic anymore. I view life very differently. I'm going to become a hospice volunteer. So he became a hospice volunteer. And in his later NDEs, which he didn't know he was going to have, and later life reviews, he got to become the people in hospice who were dying, and he got to feel the positivity that he brought to them and the comfort he brought to them as they were dying. So this is a case of someone in his near-death experience had a very objectively positive life shift that helped other people. He got to feel those benefits in his later life reviews. I mean, I have a hard time thinking that's negative. The guy came back and he was more loving toward other people, and we're saying that's a psyop. That's hard for me.
Brilliantly said. That's a perfect example. And I think probably everybody knows somebody or has heard somebody in person talk about an NDE, at least one person in their life. And it's like 99% of NDEers have a better life after their experience, or they become a better person, or they get more aligned with what they consider their spirit's true calling and all that. So how can we... if it's manipulative, it seems to be manipulative towards a good outcome. And, putting the cards on the table, if I had to put a philosophical ground to my worldview, it's that, we say that it's a consciousness-based reality, right? But what is that? It means that all is self. All that is rooted in the very same experience of I am that we hold intrinsically when all other forms of identification are stripped away, which means that, of course, in a life review where you're no longer just localized to what Bernardo Kastrup would call like a whirlpool of consciousness, that you're going to feel what other people felt because it's you that felt it. And it's paradoxical. Like we talked about at the end of our free hour last time, we can't let that lead us into like a communist I am you are me, without the understanding of our individuality. It's like both, it's a yes and thing. But I really liked how you folded in the idea that maybe the golden rule is somehow embedded into the fabric of reality, and that these NDEers are demonstrating that.
And I've heard this from some very credentialed people that led me to that conclusion. For example, Eben Alexander, former Harvard neurosurgeon, who I interviewed for my podcast, Where's My Mind also, and he's talked about this, that it seems like the golden rule based on his near-death experience is built into the fabric of reality itself. Because when you have these people have life reviews, they become the people that they affected. And so the distinction between self and other seems to go away. And so when they come back, they realize this interconnectivity. It's led Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Virginia. He's written about near-death experiences, one of the leading researchers. In his book called After, he says that it's natural law, it's beyond morality that people are describing when they talk about treating others well because we are the other to some degree. And I'll give you another example. I mentioned this in my book, An End to Upside Down Living, where in that book I talk about approaches to living life from this consciousness-centric perspective. And one of the 10 approaches I mentioned is forgiveness. I mentioned a woman named Isira who talks about how she was being murdered by a man. And during the murder, something happened where consciousness opened up. And all of a sudden, this man who was murdering her could see the broader reality, but she could also feel into him. And she felt the pain that he was experiencing that led him to try to murder her. And she then felt forgiveness for him. He ended up taking her to the hospital because he realized, he said, oh my goodness, I'm killing an angel. Like he had this big awakening that they shared together. It was like a live shared experience. I don't know what you would even call it, but she had this empathic experience. She became him. He shifted. He took her to the hospital and saved her life. And she said, look, I don't like what he did. I don't like this guy, but I forgive him because I understand that he was doing this out of his own pain. So all this, there's something built into the fabric of reality that is interconnected. And I want to also tie this back to the Nag Hammadi scriptures, because it relates to our question about dark light that we're getting into in Psyops, because the Nag Hammadi scriptures these are Gnostic Christian texts that were found, let's say 200, 300, or written 200-300 AD-ish, and they were found in 1945.
Allegedly.
That's what we're told. But they have a very, let's say, a dark origin story of humanity, that we live in a realm basically that is controlled by a being that is trying to suppress us and keep us in ignorance. But the beginning of that origin
story, the demiurge, womp womp.
Or Yaldabaoth is the name in the Secret Gospel of John. But there's also another one called On the Origin of the World and the Nature of the Rulers. These are different scriptures within the Nag Hammadi library. But this notion of a demiurge is within the context of a one. That's how it starts, is that there was one, and then the one being was reflecting, and then there was another entity that he spawned, and it was basically his wife. Barbello was the name given in one of them. And then there were luminaries that spawned from them. And then one of the luminaries had an offspring that was a rebel that created our world in which we are enslaved, but we have the divine spark within us. So even within that dark metaphysics or dark origin story, it's ultimately benevolent because there's the one beyond it. So as much as we want to talk about enslavement and psyops and shapeshifters that are trying to trick us, the bigger context is ultimately benevolent.
Oh yeah. Great conclusion. I've done so much personal research and presentations in my history that I think pretty clearly refutes the worldview that people interpret from those texts, as well as the authenticity of the texts themselves are very questionable. And I'm not criticizing you. I know you just look at what's out there. You aren't choosing a side. But, the top one would just be like, how could, if there's a God above the demiurge, how come it doesn't just automatically liberate the divine sparks? So there has to be some higher purpose, even if there was any elements of that cosmology that were true. But I want to put a little twist on it, because in the context of near-death or shared death experiences and people approaching death, like in hospice situations, there's this commonality of reports regarding a psychopomp figure or figures who help conduct the dying person's spirit to whatever is next. It's also quite common for the NDE reports to contain descriptions of figures like Jesus, Buddha, or other deities, many of which have a mythological role as a psychopomp. In the history of this show, we've extensively investigated the syncretic overlap between all of these savior types in religious mythology, showing that they're all interchangeable with one another in their naming conventions, symbolism, ceremonial rites that pertain to them, the whole nine. So at first, these consistencies might lead somebody to think that none of them are actually real, that they're vestigial remnants of an ancient, world-spanning priestly government that I alluded to earlier. But I've, for a while, been entertaining another theory from the mind-centric cosmology as opposed to the physicalist, materialist paradigm, the universal religious doctrine of divine emanations from a pleroma or source that is actually described in those Gnostic creation texts, that each layer of reality flows out of a center of eternal unified consciousness like ripples, and that each concentric ring represents a complexifying, fragmenting, or multiplication of individual consciousnesses. So like there's one being in the center, and each ripple out that gets bigger, there's more beings till you get to like 7 billion humans. And I think this could account for, because this is a universal part of the esoteric doctrine of all world religions, modern and ancient. And I think this could account for the ubiquitous contact with a psychopomp being, that the Son of God, or as the Greeks called it, the protogonos, it could be the first mind to emerge out of the unified source. They call this being the firstborn of the first cause. And like the trunk of a sort of tree of life, all the other forms of life or consciousness might grow out of it. And in this model, Jesus and all the other deities that correlate to him could have a reality to them, especially being the trunk of this tree, and that their willingness to help us might be akin to our willingness to help our own body parts when they're injured. Like we're the leaves or the branches off of this bigger unit, like one life situation. I know I just put a lot on the table, but I'd like to know how your research or your just own feelings support an idea like that.
I lean in that direction. Just based on the totality of things I've seen, something like that makes the most sense. It's like a layered metaphysics, basically centered around unity. So it's highly paradoxical, because at one level, I think what you're describing is just a oneness that pervades all. But within that oneness, there are layers, and seemingly there is amnesia within that, almost like the movie Inception, like dreams inside of dreams. I always think of that metaphor. And there could be a hierarchy within that, where there are beings that want to help them or are more advanced. There are different levels of that consciousness. And it goes back to the Bernardo Kastrup analogy of dissociative identity disorder, that there is a universal consciousness that is dissociated into different whirlpools. And those whirlpools might be multidimensional, or maybe even the stream of water is multidimensional. And so what we talk about as deities, or even various origin stories, that there's layers of truth. So at one level, one thing is true, that you could be enslaved on some level, but at another level of truth, you're not enslaved. And these are the ultimate paradoxes. So it just depends on the zoom level at which you look at things.
Yeah, that's a good point. It depends on and even the idea of dimensions. I think of that like dimensions of scale. So the zoom level question, as you say, and feels like, especially when we have these bigger expanded consciousness experiences that come through psychedelics or NDEs, or occasionally spontaneously, it's like we get temporarily snapped into a different frame. And maybe the more hellish type of NDEs would be like shrinking to a smaller frame, as if the smaller the frame, or the further the zoom, or the further from the center, the less light is available, or the more fragmentation is there. That all makes a lot of sense. But man, we're getting into some good stuff. We got the second hour coming up soon, but I want to make sure that before we do our transition, that you can give any further thoughts or closing ideas to the free hour, promote what you might want them to know about, or tell them what's coming next.
I would just thank your audience for tuning into this. I want to reiterate, this is an incredibly complex topic. I'm glad we ended on this notion of layers of truth, because it's a nice lens when evaluating all this stuff. And I will say that even learning about these topics, or the possibility that there's reality to any of it, has been extremely mind expanding for me in a positive way, because it helps to take one away from just the narrowness of everyday life, which is, I'm not saying that's not important too, but it helps to recontextualize, to say, wow, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot that we don't see with our eyes. And perhaps our consciousness isn't accessing things that actually exist or that we've experienced, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. So that alone, who knows what that does? If consciousness is fundamental, having this new perspective, that could actually shift our reality by just being aware of these new possibilities. And in terms of how to find me, if you're interested in learning more, my website is a good place to start. It's markgober.com, MARKGOBER.com. As of today, we're talking late July. I have 6 books out, although there's a 7th coming soon. And all the books are available in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible format.
Man, it's such a blast to talk with you. I feel like the energy of this one is awesome. Like just boom, boom, boom. We're hitting so many cool topics. Got a lot to talk about in part 2, including now, the other side of the coin, as in the potentially malevolent intelligences that are part of this equation, and so much more to discuss beyond that. So, dude, it's been super awesome, and appreciate you. And I really can't wait for the new book. I've been secretly told what it's about, and it's going to be really fun when we get to do an interview on that one. So thanks, man. This is great. Can't wait for part 2.
Awesome. Thank you, Chance.
I don't know how to say it, but boom. That was an awesome episode. I hope you guys had fun. I really liked getting out of I wouldn't call it a rut, but like kind of a long running theme of more health oriented or like energy work oriented type of topics on InnerVerse, and all that stuff's important. But to start exploring some other areas of the fringe was really fun. And Mark is the guy to do it. I can't wait for his new book that I'm not allowed to tell you exactly what it's about yet, but I'll just say it's gonna really help everybody's whole worldview, just like every other book that he's had. So big thanks to Mark. Definitely check out his stuff. I think that his work really holds up as something you can just hand off to a curious and inquiring mind that might be new to a subject. Like my wife and I talk about all the time how the awakening journey, the truth. It does not come with a roadmap, and it's very easy to get stuck in the swamp of sorrows or the, demiurge is controlling me, archons solutioning me type of worldview, or all kinds of other unhelpful places like the white hats are going to fix it for me. I just got to wait out the storm, mount up patriots, all that. So bringing it always back to consciousness, and that's where his first book explored the hard problem of consciousness, the mental nature of reality, and everything he's done since then keeps anchored to that one philosophical ground that is the most empowering and powerful way and lens of looking at the world. So I appreciate that a lot. I love hanging with Mark. We had a good chat after the recording was over, but for everybody that's curious what's in part 2, man, it was a jam-packed part 1. We actually got through all my notes, which was pretty incredible. Part 2, we talked about further fallacies around the contact phenomenon, particularly starting out about the not exclusively benevolent aspect of the contact phenomenon, dark spirits. It was actually super cool that he talks about Dr. Thomas Zinser, who longtime listeners will know I really like his work and his whole thing about subpersonalities and dark spirits. And so we talked about attachments and entities and what you might, from a religious perspective, call demonic elements of this contact phenomenon. We discussed that old serpent, not the devil, but Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, the military's resident satanic high priest, and a specific interesting case and high-level account of possession, it ritually induced. That was a fascinating case. We got into the implants, alien implants, physical evidence aspect of it. What do these dark beings actually want? What does it have to do with human reproductive power or the generative principle of the cosmos and that great mystery of mysteries? Got into MILABS, the military abductions. Talked about the potential one world government implications and intentions behind so much of the Galactic Federation jive that gets out there in these circles. And, listeners will be aware, I'm not on a globe. I'm not in a galaxy as described. I'm not personally feeling it whenever people talk about the secret space programs or the Arcturians or the Pleiadians or whatever. I'm not ruling out that they're having some kind of experience in a channeling sense or whatever, but what that experience is, at the end of the day, with Mark's work, we don't know. We don't know what it is, and nobody does, and that's why he wrote the book, to talk about just how much we don't know what's exactly going on. Then we got into the fallacy number 5, that contact is a recent phenomenon only. Talked about some of the antiquity of the stuff, fallen angels, astrotheology, goblins, dwarves, fairies, all that good stuff. And then we also talked about the ways that the contact phenomenon has played a role in the direction of human civilization and potentially even technological inventions that are gained from interactions. There's so much there. It's a really great second part. I barely even scratched the surface of the type of stuff that we're going to be ladling to you. If you do sign up, you can get my Patreon easily, $5 a month. Got the whole archive of everything I've ever done. It's the way to go, in my opinion, because Patreon actually gives you a sweet RSS feed link that you can plug into your favorite podcast player and get all the updates of all the content, extended or free, in the same place, just like you would get a podcast from subscribing to it through iTunes. Really handy. And of course, the videos are going to be there available too. But it goes back all the way to the entirety of my whole archive, even the stuff I'm a little embarrassed about now. Maybe the way Mark would be a little embarrassed about some parts of this book that's only 2 years old. I get it. We always love our current creation the most, and we look sideways at what we used to think, and that's part of progress. That's really good. So on that subject, I do recommend people that might be newer to the show, even newer like the last 2 years, check out the archives. Go back into the past, 2021, 2020. There's really good stuff there. You don't have to listen to it all. I wouldn't blame you if you just skipped around and picked the ones that sounded interesting, but we've done some good stuff, especially if you've been missing the type of content that gives you that mythology, symbolism, language gravy. And maybe there's some you missed back there. Maybe some old episodes with me and Dylan, Sakosio, or Mario Garza, our resident symbological regulars. Love those guys. On the subject of Dylan, if you sign up for my Patreon, you're also going to get access to episode 7 of the Inner World podcast that we do, Decoding the Devil, part 2 of the devil subject. Man, is it deep, and it's a good one. Hope you enjoyed the preview at least. It was a long preview, but $5 a month, you're getting all this research content, all the exclusive second hours on Patreon. It's so worth it. Do I have to make it any more obvious how worth it is to give $5 for awesome stuff? I mean, if you like this show, but there's other ways to do it. You can join my YouTube membership, subscription channel membership. I don't know exactly how to call that, but it is an option. It's always going to be linked in the episode description. That's a way to get plus content. And there's Rockfin. Rockfin's great. Got a lot of perks to it. You get access to all the other premium content there. But the only difference is I don't put the Inner World shows on Rockfin because I want you to be exclusively, specifically supporting me or Dylan to get that stuff. And I think that it's worth it. Anyway, Patreon's kind of a better deal. But I don't care how you do it as long as you do it. Other ways to support the show, you could get some Tippecanoe herbs action with the InnerVerse coupon code. There's also the excellent Lotus Way flower essence elixirs and hydrosol sprays. I'm loving those quite a bit. And that's linked in the show notes. Just using my affiliate link, you'll get it. And there's biofield tuning. Super exciting to announce that I've done some big overhauls on my website, and the biofield tuning page is much better. And you can now book a session through the website, e-commerce on the site. You don't have to go. And I mean, maybe it looks a little sketchy what I was doing before, but you'd have to send me money on PayPal or Cash App and then email me, and then we'd set up your session. You can still do that, and that's been working fine. But it's a much tidier option that you can just check out with a cart on the site. I feel like everybody wins with that. It's a much clearer way to do it. So check out the site. And there's also tons of free information about your biofield anatomy, your energy body dynamics, and how tuning even works in case you want to figure it out for yourself the way I did. So hope you guys dig it and get yourself some tuning sessions. They've been excellent as always. Quite excellent. I could go on and on. Other things to talk about on the subject we've been getting into in this episode is I would consider following Mark on Instagram if you use it, because Mark Gober's Instagram is full of interesting stuff that he's looking at in the moment. Lately, he's been interacting with the chat GPTs and AI bots, asking them questions about virology and germ theory and stuff. And basically these language model data aggregating chat bots, they kind of have to tell you the truth if you ask the question the right way. Because it's basically you're a programmer when you ask the question. And Mark's been really asking good questions, and it's been interesting to see what comes up with that. And I like that about his Instagram. It's worth following. Man, I'm just still vibing off of that show. I could almost just get into talking more and more about the subject and some things that didn't come up. Hope everybody is cool with me being a little more wordy, and this is more of a conversation, despite the fact that I had a lot of questions. But this is stuff that I've looked at for years. So I maybe had some things to get off my chest. And I think that it was a great reflection back and forth with me and Mark. And our rapport is growing. And I think he's got to be in the running for my top favorite new regular. I'm sure that he'll be a regular. I think you might see him again as early as September when we talk about his brand new secret still book. Oh, but it's going to blow your mind. Okay. I'm done here. Let's get out of here. It's been fun. Thanks for tuning in. If you like it, at the very least, you could support by leaving a review on iTunes or something. But don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, anywhere that there's podcasts served. You're going to find it. And leaving comments and reviews and liking and sharing is very helpful. The YouTube channel just broke the 10,000 mark. Really appreciating that. So whatever you guys can do, you're my ad agency. And with shadow banning and all, I need the help if you can swing it. But just being here makes me happy. I'm glad you're here. Love you. I'll see you guys on the next one. Really exciting stuff on the calendar. Much love and bye-bye.